August 1988. Carlos Lehder, one of Pablo Escobar's most trusted pilots, was flying a Cessna 206 over the Caribbean Sea at 2 a.m., heading from a remote airstrip in Colombia to a drop point in the Bahamas. In the cargo hold behind him were $20 million in cash, U.S. $100 bills, vacuum-sealed in waterproof bags, payment for a massive cocaine shipment that had been delivered the previous week. It was a routine flight. Carlos had made this run dozens of times. He knew the route by heart, knew how to avoid radar, knew how to navigate by the stars when he had to fly without instruments. But at 2:47 a.m., somewhere over the open ocean between Colombia and the Bahamas, engine failed. No warning, no sputtering, just a sudden, complete loss of power. And Carlos Lehder, experienced pilot, veteran of hundreds of smuggling runs, had about 90 seconds to decide whether he was going to die in the Caribbean Sea or do something that would become one of the most legendary survival stories in the history of drug trafficking. Carlos Lehder was 38 years old in 1988, had been flying for Pablo Escobar since 1982, when Pablo was still building his empire and needed pilots who were skilled, fearless, and willing to take risks that legitimate pilots would never consider. Carlos was all three. He'd learned to fly in the Colombian Air Force, had been dishonorably discharged for smuggling contraband, and had immediately been recruited by the Medellin cartel. For 6 years, he'd flown cocaine from Colombia to the United States, from Colombia to the Caribbean, from Colombia to anywhere Pablo needed product delivered. He'd flown through storms, flown without lights to avoid detection, flown so low over the ocean that the spray from the waves hit his windshield. He'd been shot at by Coast Guard helicopters, had crash-landed twice and walked away both times, had made Pablo Escobar millions of dollars, and had been paid handsomely for it. But he'd never had an engine fail over open ocean in the middle of the night with $20 million in the cargo hold and no land in sight. When the engine died, Carlos's first thought was that he'd been sabotaged, that someone had tampered with the plane, that this was an assassination attempt. But there was no time to figure out why, only time to react. He checked his instruments. Altitude, 8,000 feet. Airspeed, 140 knots. Rate of descent, increasing. He had maybe 2 minutes before he hit the water, maybe less. He grabbed the radio, called his contact in the Bahamas, gave his last known position, said the engine was dead and he was going down. The contact asked if he could make it to land. Carlos checked his navigation. The nearest island was 30 miles away. He was losing altitude at 500 feet per minute. He did the math in his head. He'd hit the water in 16 minutes. He couldn't glide 30 miles in 16 minutes. Not in a Cessna 206. Not without power. Negative, Carlos said into the radio. I'm going in the water. Send coordinates to Pablo. Tell him the cargo is on board. Then he focused on survival. He couldn't save the plane, but maybe he could save himself. And maybe he could save the money. He turned on his emergency transponder so search and rescue could find him. Then he started preparing for a water land, tightened his seatbelt, made sure his life vest was accessible, opened the cargo door so it wouldn't jam on impact, and then, in the last 30 seconds before he hit the water, he did something that most pilots wouldn't have thought of. He grabbed one of the waterproof bags of money, $2 million, and strapped it to his chest with cargo netting. If he survived the crash, if he made it to land, he wanted to have something to show Pablo. Wanted to prove that he'd tried to save the cargo. The impact was brutal. The plane hit the water at 80 knots, nose first. The windshield shattered. Water rushed into the cockpit. Carlos felt his ribs crack from the seatbelt, felt his head slam against the instrument panel, felt the plane start to sink immediately. He unbuckled, grabbed his life vest, kicked his way out through the broken windshield, surfaced, gasped for air, looked around for the plane. It was already gone, sunk in less than 30 seconds. $20 million. Well, $18 million now that he had $2 million strapped to his chest, gone to the bottom of the Caribbean Sea. Carlos floated in the darkness for 6 hours. The sun came up. He could see an island in the distance, maybe 5 miles away. He started swimming. It took him 4 hours. By the time he dragged himself onto the beach, he was exhausted, dehydrated, injured, and carrying $2 million in waterproof bags that had somehow stayed intact through the crash and the swim. He found a small fishing village, used some of the cash to buy food, water, and access to a phone. Called his contact in the Bahamas, told him what had happened. The contact said he'd send someone to pick Carlos up, and he called Pablo to let him know about the crash. 2 hours later, Carlos's satellite phone rang. It was Pablo. You lost my money, Pablo said. No greeting, no asking if Carlos was okay, just a statement of fact. The engine failed, Carlos said. I had no choice. I had a ditch in the ocean. Where's the plane? Bottom of the ocean. Maybe 200 meters down. I don't know the exact depth. And the money? Same place. Except for 2 million. I saved 2 million. It's with me. There was a long silence. Carlos could hear Pablo breathing on the other end of the line. Could imagine him sitting in one of his safe houses, calculating, deciding whether Carlos was telling the truth or whether this was a scam. You saved 2 million, Pablo finally said. What about the other 18? It's in the plane. At the bottom of the ocean. Then go get it. Carlos laughed. He thought Pablo was joking. Boss, the plane is 200 meters down. I'm not a diver. I don't have equipment. I don't even know exactly where it went down. You have the transponder coordinates. You know approximately where it is. And you have $2 million to buy equipment and hire help. So go get my money, Carlos. Or don't come back. The line went dead. Carlos stared at the phone. He wasn't sure if Pablo was serious, but he also wasn't sure Pablo was joking. And he knew one thing for certain. If he showed up in Medellin with only 2 million of the 20 million he'd been transporting, Pablo would kill him, would assume he'd stolen the rest, would make an example of him. Carlos had seen what Pablo did to people who lost his money, had seen the bodies, had heard the stories. He had two choices: try to recover the money, or disappear and hope Pablo never found him. He decided to try to recover the money. Carlos had never been a diver, had never even snorkeled. The closest he'd come to underwater experience was swimming in rivers as a child in Colombia. But he had the transponder coordinates from the crash, had a general idea of where the plane had gone down, approximately 2 miles offshore from the island where he'd washed up. And he had $2 million to fund the recovery operation, money that would either save his life or be wasted on a suicide mission. He hired a local fisherman named Miguel who knew the waters, who'd spent 40 years fishing these seas and knew every current, every reef, every dangerous spot. Miguel was skeptical when Carlos explained what he wanted to do, told him that 200 meters was death depth for recreational divers, that the pressure at that depth would crush his lungs if he wasn't careful, that nitrogen narcosis would make him hallucinate, make him do stupid things, make him forget he was underwater, that decompression sickness, the bends, would kill him if he ascended too fast. But Miguel also needed money. His boat was falling apart. His family was struggling. And Carlos was offering him $10,000 just to help with the search and provide surface support. Carlos bought diving equipment from a shop in Nassau: tanks, regulators, weights, fins, masks, depth gauges, dive computers. Spent $30,000 on gear. The shop owner asked what he was planning to dive. Carlos lied, said he was exploring shallow reefs. The shop owner looked at the amount of equipment Carlos was buying: multiple tanks, backup regulators, technical diving gear, and knew Carlos was lying. But he didn't ask questions. In the Bahamas in 1988, you learned not to ask questions when someone was paying cash. Carlos hired a diving instructor named James, a former British Navy diver who'd retired to the Caribbean and now taught tourists how to snorkel. James agreed to give Carlos a crash course in diving. 3 days, 8 hours a day. Everything from basic breathing techniques to emergency procedures. James was blunt from the start. 3 days isn't enough. You need months of training. Years for technical diving. What you're planning is suicide. But Carlos insisted. And James, who was being paid $5,000 for 3 days of work, agreed to teach him as much as possible. They started in shallow water. 5 meters. 10 meters. James taught Carlos how to breathe through a regulator, how to clear his mask if it flooded, how to equalize the pressure in his ears as he descended, how to control his buoyancy, how to read his gauges, how to signal for help. Basic skills that most divers spend weeks mastering. Carlos had 3 days. On the second day, they went deeper, 20 meters, 30 meters. Carlos started to feel the effects of pressure. His ears hurt. His sinuses ached. The nitrogen in his bloodstream started to affect his thinking, made him feel slightly drunk, slightly disconnected from reality. James watched him carefully, saw the signs of narcosis, brought him back to the surface, explained that what Carlos had felt at 30 meters would be 10 times worse at 200 meters, that he'd be hallucinating, that he'd have to work through it, that most divers couldn't. On the third day, James took Carlos to 50 meters, the deepest recreational diving depth, the point where nitrogen narcosis becomes dangerous for untrained divers. Carlos descended slowly, equalizing every few meters, breathing carefully, watching his gauges. At 40 meters, he started to feel strange. At 50 meters, he was convinced there was someone swimming next to him. He turned to look. Nobody there. Just the hallucination. Just his brain being affected by the nitrogen. He forced himself to focus, to remember why he was there, to remember that Pablo Escobar was waiting for his money. To remember that failure meant death. James brought him back up, told him he'd done well for a beginner, told him he had natural ability, but also told him that 200 meters was 4 times deeper than they'd just gone, that the narcosis would be overwhelming, that Carlos would probably die if he tried it. Carlos thanked James for the training, paid him his $5,000, and told him he was going down anyway. On the 4th day, they went out to the crash site, used the transponder coordinates to narrow down the search area, used sonar equipment that Carlos had rented, another $10,000, to scan the ocean floor, and after 6 hours of searching, moving in a grid pattern, checking and rechecking, they found it. The plane, sitting upright on the ocean floor at 197 meters depth. The sonar image showed the distinctive shape of the Cessna 206. The cargo door still open, and presumably, the money still inside. The diving instructor James had refused to come on this trip, had told Carlos he wanted no part of suicide mission, so it was just Carlos and Miguel on the boat. Miguel looked at the depth reading, looked at Carlos, said, "You're really going to do this?" Carlos nodded. "I don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Now when Pablo Escobar is waiting for his money." Miguel understood. In the Caribbean in 1988, everyone knew who Pablo Escobar was. Everyone knew what happened to people who disappointed him. Miguel crossed himself, said a prayer, and helped Carlos prepare for the dive. The first dive almost killed him. Carlos descended too fast, excited, eager to reach the plane, not following the careful descent rate that James had taught him. By the time he reached 100 meters, his ears were screaming in pain. By 150 meters, he was seeing things that weren't there. Sharks circling him, his dead mother calling his name, the plane moving, swimming away from him like a living thing. He knew these were hallucinations. James had warned him, but knowing didn't make them less real, didn't make them less terrifying. At 170 meters, he almost dropped his regulator. His hands felt numb. His fingers wouldn't work properly. He fumbled with the mouthpiece, nearly lost it, managed to keep it in his mouth through sheer panic. He looked at his depth gauge. Still 30 meters to go. He couldn't do it. Couldn't make it. Was going to die down here in the dark water with Pablo's money just meters away. Miguel, watching from the surface, saw Carlos's bubbles stop rising, saw the dive line go slack, knew something was wrong. He grabbed the line and started pulling, hauled Carlos up as fast as he dared, knowing that bringing him up too quickly could kill him from decompression sickness, but also knowing that leaving him down there would definitely kill him. Carlos surfaced unconscious. Miguel pulled him onto the boat, slapped his face. Carlos coughed up seawater, opened his eyes, vomited over the side of the boat, spent the next 12 hours in agony. His head felt like it was splitting open. His joints ached. His lungs burned. He was experiencing mild decompression sickness from the rapid ascent. Not severe enough to kill him, but severe enough to make him wish he was dead. But he went down again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each time, he went a little deeper, stayed a little longer, got a little closer to the plane, learned how to manage the narcosis, learned how to work through the hallucinations, learned how to move slowly, carefully, conservatively at depth. On the 7th dive, he reached the plane, swam through the cargo door, saw the bags of money floating in the cabin, held in place by cargo netting, started pulling them out, could only carry 2 bags at a time, about $2 million, had to make multiple dives, multiple trips to the surface, multiple hours of decompression to avoid the bends. It took 3 weeks, 21 days of diving, sometimes twice a day when the weather was good, sometimes not at all when storms made it too dangerous. Carlos lost 20 pounds, developed a persistent cough from the pressure on his lungs, got an ear infection that made every dive agony. But he kept going, kept diving, kept recovering money. By the end of the 3 weeks, he'd recovered 18 of the $20 million. $2 million had been lost, either swept away by currents or buried in sand or damaged beyond recovery. But 18 million was in waterproof bags on the fishing boat, ready to be delivered to Pablo Escobar. Carlos called Pablo, told him he'd recovered the money. Pablo was silent for a long moment. 18 million? Pablo asked. Yes, 2 million was lost, but I got the rest. You went down 200 meters, with 3 days of training. Yes, and you didn't die. No. Another long silence. Then Pablo laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh. Carlos, you're either the bravest man I know or the stupidest. Maybe both. Bring me my money, and when you get here, we'll talk about your future. Carlos delivered the $18 million to Pablo 2 days later. Expected to be punished for losing the $2 million. Expected Pablo to be angry. Instead, Pablo promoted him, made him head of air operations for the entire Medellin cartel, gave him a bonus, $500,000 for recovering the money, and told everyone in the organization the story of how Carlos had crashed in the ocean and spent 3 weeks diving to recover Pablo's money. The story became legend in the cartel. Other pilots heard it. Other smugglers heard it. And the message was clear. If you work for Pablo Escobar, you do whatever it takes. You don't make excuses. You don't give up. You solve the problem, or you die trying. Carlos became a symbol of that philosophy. The pilot who'd crashed with $20 million and refused to accept failure. But the story didn't end there. Because Carlos's 3-week diving operation had attracted attention. Local fishermen had seen him, had seen the money, had talked about it in bars and markets. And eventually, word reached the DEA. They started investigating, started asking questions, started putting together a case. In 1991, 3 years after the crash, Carlos Lehder was arrested by Colombian authorities working with the DEA. Not for the crash, not for the diving, but for his role in the Medellin cartel's smuggling operations. He was extradited to the United States, tried on drug trafficking charges, and sentenced to life in prison plus 135 years. During his trial, prosecutors brought up the diving incident, used it as evidence of Carlos's dedication to the cartel, used it to argue that he was a key player in Pablo's organization. Carlos's lawyer tried to spin it differently, tried to argue that Carlos had been coerced, that Pablo had threatened to kill him if he didn't recover the money, that Carlos was a victim, not a criminal. The jury didn't buy it. Carlos was convicted on all counts. But in prison, Carlos became something of a celebrity. Other inmates heard the story. Guards heard the story. And Carlos, who'd spent 3 weeks diving 200 meters with minimal training to recover $18 million, became known as the diver. Prisoners asked him to tell the story, asked him what it was like, asked him if he'd been scared. Carlos always gave the same answer. I was terrified every single dive, but I was more scared of Pablo than I was of drowning. Fear is a powerful motivator. In 1995, Carlos agreed to cooperate with U.S. authorities, provided information about Pablo Escobar's operations, though Pablo was already dead by then, killed in 1993, provided information about other cartel members, and in exchange, his sentence was reduced. He was released in 2020 after serving 29 years. When he got out, a journalist tracked him down, asked him about his life, about his time with Pablo, about the diving incident. Carlos, now 70 years old, was willing to talk. People ask me if I regret working for Pablo, Carlos said. And I tell them, of course I do. I spent 30 years in prison. I lost my family. I lost my life. But do I regret the diving? No. That was the most alive I've ever felt. 3 weeks of pure survival, pure determination, pure refusal to give up. I learned something about myself during those dives. I learned that I could do things I never thought possible, that I could push through fear and pain and exhaustion and still accomplish the mission. That's not something I regret. That's something I'm proud of. The journalist asked, would you do it again? Carlos laughed. No, absolutely not. I got lucky. I should have died a dozen times during those dives. Nitrogen narcosis, decompression sickness, equipment failure, sharks. Any one of those things could have killed me. The fact that I survived was a miracle, or maybe just dumb luck, but I wouldn't tempt fate twice. What happened to the 2 million that was lost? Still at the bottom of the Caribbean, maybe buried in sand, maybe swept away by currents, maybe found by some lucky fisherman. I don't know, and I don't care. I got 18 million. That was enough to save my life. The other 2 million? That's the ocean's payment for letting me survive. The interview was published in 2021, and the story of Carlos Lehder's 3-week diving operation to recover Pablo Escobar's money became famous all over again. Diving instructors used it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of technical diving without proper training. Aviation experts analyzed what had caused the engine failure, most likely fuel contamination, though it was never proven. And people who'd never heard of Pablo Escobar or the Medellin cartel learned about the pilot who'd crashed with $20 million and refused to give up. Carlos Lehder died in 2023 at the age of 73. His obituary mentioned his conviction for drug trafficking, mentioned his cooperation with authorities, mentioned his release from prison. But what most people remembered was the diving story. The 3 weeks he'd spent going down 200 meters with minimal training to recover $18 million from the ocean. The sheer audacity of it, the determination, the refusal to accept failure, even when failure seemed inevitable. And in the world of aviation, among pilots who fly dangerous routes and take dangerous risks, Carlos Lehder became a legend, not for his smuggling, not for his work with Pablo Escobar, but for what he did after the crash, for the choice he made to dive instead of run, For the 3 weeks, he spent proving that sometimes the only way out is down.